Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics, and so with the UK leaving the EU at the end of this month, attention then turns towards the next phase of Brexit. Of course, many of those looking forward to it think that Brexit will be ending at this point, but as we know, we'll just be entering one of the lengthier phases of it. Namely, in this case, the acquisition of agreements with countries around the world, including those right on our doorstep. But before that, we have 11 months of a transition period in order to work out a more permanent arrangement. And in this video, I'd like to go over what that transition period actually gives us and therefore what we will lose at the end of it. But first, if you want to see more of my videos, then please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So essentially, the transition period keeps us in the single market. Now, this is important to make sure that we prevent the Operation Yellowhammer chaos that would completely knacker our trade around the world. Not just with the EU, we have to bear in mind we have trade agreements with other countries based on membership of the EU. And remember that although the government was supposed to be arranging separate trade agreements with the other countries, the non-EU countries around the world, to follow our exit from the EU, well, very few of them were actually done because most countries, and the countries we trade a lot with, told us to bugger off until we'd got a deal with the EU. So when it comes to exiting the EU, the citizens most affected will, of course, be British citizens living in the EU and EU citizens living in the UK. Now, from the EU's point of view, they see nothing at all wrong with allowing all of the current rights to continue, but it must be reciprocated. Now, the UK government is not at all keen on reciprocating, and although they've banged on about how many settled status claims that they've okayed, they have refused just as many, with many more still being processed. So for those worried about their status, well, for the transition period, there'll still be the right to travel, to work and to retire as normal for the next year. After the transition period ends, well, that'll very much depend on what the UK government agrees to, and the way it's going, they don't sound like they want to agree to very much. Now, for British citizens who wish to retire in an EU country, because Britain won't be an EU country in another month's time, they can do that, and they still get to keep a lot of the benefits even when the transition period is over, but not all of them. It is worth bearing in mind that the withdrawal agreement isn't just a deal on the transition period, but it is an international treaty in its own right. It sets up some permanent agreements beyond the transition period. So it will last until one side of them either breaches it or both of them agree to replace it with something else. So after the transition period, employment rights would end because the UK government has promised to put an end to freedom of movement. And without freedom of movement, you can't just have people, living and working between the UK and the EU. So if you want a summer job, if you're a student or gap year, and you want a summer job in an EU country this summer, then knock yourself out. That'll be fine. If you're looking at a more permanent position, you may need to reconsider. With even the threat of settled status for British citizens working in the EU in serious doubt, because bear in mind there are countries in the EU that are sort of happy to grant settled status, but they want it reciprocated. They don't yet know what the UK government's going to do. So there's a serious amount of doubt over the settled status of a lot of British citizens in different EU countries. And so a lot of companies on the continent are unlikely to want to employ British workers now for fear of suddenly losing employees at the end of the next year. And after Brexit, they'll be free to discriminate on that basis. Now, when it comes to scientific research, we can still apply for Horizon 2020 funding. We can also apply for European Regional Development Funds as well as European Social Funds, but that will be just for one more year. I can't imagine long-term projects are going to get much of a look in. When it comes to healthcare, a big one, obviously, if you live abroad, whether you're an EU citizen living in the UK or UK citizen living in the EU, you're still eligible to receive treatment in any EU country. It's worth mentioning at this point that it is your own country that pays for it, but if treatment needed isn't really available in your own country, then you can travel to another one within the EU and get the treatment where it is. That will end when the transition period ends, but you'll be fine up until then. So again, any treatment that is likely to need to continue beyond a year could be difficulties there. Finally, I would say, in terms of the key benefits the transition period gives us, if you're a student, you're still able to access the Erasmus programme for the duration of the transition period. In theory, that could still apply after the transition period. But again, that very much depends on negotiations. And again, given that Boris Johnson has said that the transition period is definitely ending at the end of 2020, and nobody in the EU believes that a deal will be in place by then, I wouldn't hold out much hope. So if you're going to try and study in Europe on a programme that would extend beyond the end of 2020, no, I wouldn't have thought that would be hopeful. Ultimately, when you break down all of the benefits and restrictions that EU membership means, the single most notable feature is freedom of movement, which doesn't mean the same thing that some people think it does, but it is very important. And ending it is going to mean delays to everything involving any form of travel between the UK and the EU for any reason. That includes goods as well as people. And those delays are annoying for holidaygoers. You just think, oh, if I have to wait an extra few hours, that's annoying. Yes, that's annoying. But it's ruinous for economic travel, so to speak, whether that's people need to travel for their work or transport of goods or anything like that. And it's the insistence by the UK government that freedom of movement will end that will cause those problems that both government and independent research, reports have been warning us about. In addition, the fact that we are not putting in place the infrastructure necessary to facilitate the checks that would have to happen, that's going to cause even greater delays, because that is the maddening thing for me. I mean, delays exist in lots of parts of the world. Not all of the world uses the EU model. Lots of parts of the world, you've got to have checks on goods and people travelling between countries that share a border. This is all perfectly normal. And the way it's dealt with is border forces, border checks. This all happens all to facilitate the movement of people and goods. We're going to need more of them. I mean, we have some of them already, because we have people from countries outside of the EU that we don't have these arrangements with. We have goods coming from outside of the EU for which we don't have completely free movement coming across, and we can do the checks on those. But of course, the bulk of people and goods travelling to the UK are travelling directly from the EU, and it massively dwarfs all the rest, and we don't have the facilities to run the checks on them. So we're going to need to do that, and as far as I can see, there are no real moves to do that. And in fact, the civil service are basically saying, if we started now, if Boris Johnson gives us the go-ahead to go mad, if he just says to us, look, we're completely coming out of the transition period, we may not have a deal in place, we're going to have to get ready for masses more checks, we need the facilities in place, go Whitehall, go, put it in place. They don't now have time. And he hasn't done that. He hasn't done that. So it's all right banging on about World Trade Organization terms being all right for us, even though they are demonstrably not. But those terms are not supposed to include being stuck at a border for days on end. And for those for whom the transition period rights are extremely important, there is a guidance document which you may find useful on the EU website, which I'll put a link to in the description below. Essentially, what I would say is, if you are living in a country for which you do not have permanent settled status. So let's say you're a UK citizen living in a different EU country. If you're an EU citizen, I mean, that's not you. If you're going to be an EU citizen still in February, should we say, because I'm an EU citizen now, but I won't be in February. If you're an EU citizen in February, living in the UK, you need to check this out. Similarly, if you are a business owner or you're an employer who employs people from a different country, again, you probably should check it out. What I would say is, although the ending of the transition period will cause significant amounts of chaos to the rest of our lives, you won't necessarily need to read the document to help you, because knowing what is going to go wrong is not actually going to help you deal with it, I would suggest, in most people's cases. However, as I say, if residency is an issue for you, that obviously is crucial. You don't want to find yourself stateless. I mean, I personally think it is disgraceful. You've got that our government are allowing a scenario to occur where you've got families, you've got two people married with children. Let's say in this country, let's say you've got an Italian who's married a British person and they've got British children, that the Italian person may be told they have no settlement rights in the UK, which is possible. And so what do? They get kicked out of the country, but their family can't go with them because that British partner and the British children don't have settled status in Italy or indeed anywhere else in the EU potentially. So you're potentially breaking families up like this. And again, families that don't want to be broken up. And all the UK government would have had to do was to say, look, if they want to bang on about immigration, fine, whatever. It's not actually fine, but whatever. They could still say, but the people already living here and have already made a life here, give them settled status. That's the least we can do, and it is. But they're not even really doing that. So it is worrying times for people, but not everyone needs to be worried. So it is important you get the right information, and this document may help you with that. And if you need further information, I mean, you just have to contact your consulate. I was talking to someone actually who's a British citizen living in Spain, and she's going to be fine. She knows she's going to be fine. But she's had that confirmed, so it'll just be important to get it confirmed. Imagine the worst case scenario, the transition period ends with no deal. What is your status? Find that out. Work on the worst case scenario, unfortunately, I think is what you have to do. But anyway, I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, then please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.